Hey, show of hands, quick show of hands. How many people here have 11.6? Okay, of the people who have 11.6, how many people have downloaded the 11.6 example content from their user account? How many people have looked at it? Okay, good, good. I just want to check because the content that I'm going to show you today, it's all from the 11.6 example content in your user accounts. I'm just here for Q&A about certain features. So this first example I'm showing here is it's a simple setup, but it looks really neat. And that's an example of using raycasting for precise placement of items in your scene. So how many people have dipped into raycasting yet in 11.6? Okay, I'm going to start giving a quick overview of that. So let me clear the scene. It's not hard. You just have to be a little bit aware of what's going on. So let me go add a ground plane. And I'm going to tilt it. That's big and spectacular. I'm going to add a null. I'm going to move that null over here. And at frame 120, I'm going to move it over here, make a key. And you know what, for good measure, I'll just do it here. So, you look at the relation of the null between the null and this ground plane. And the null's always over the ground plane, but the ground plane's tilted. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use raycasting to position the null against this ground plane. So in order to do that, I want it to affect the motion path. So I'm going to use a motion modifier. So I typed M for motion, add modifier, Nodal Motion. How many people here use nodes? Just wanted to check. Well, in order to take advantage of raycasting at this time in LightWave 11.6, you're going to have to use nodes. It is a node. So you apply Nodal Motion, double click on it to open up the Nodal Motion interface. So I'm going to look up RayCast Geometry, double click on it to add it here. Okay. So here's a node, and I want it to affect the position. And what this node does is based on an origin and a direction, it will fire a ray in the direction that I tell it to do. By default, that direction is pointing straight down. 0 on the X, 0 on the Z, but -1 on the Y means an arrow pointing straight down in mathematical terms. I want to tell it to look at the new ground plane object, so I have to put a check mark there. If nothing is checked, it can't quote unquote see anything in the scene. I have to tell it, I have to make it aware of what object in the scene I want it to target. And okay, so it's going to, for the origin by default will be the pivot of the item. Nothing's happening right now because I haven't told it what to do with that data. But given intersect means where that ray intersects with the target geometry in this case being new ground plane object. So I'm going to take intersect, plug it into position, and then all of a sudden it's sticking to the target geometry. So let me do that fast. Double click on RayCast, all right, load up RayCast Geometry, target the ground plane, plug intersect into position, and that's it. That's how fast it is without me stopping to explain what I'm doing every single click.
Then you have to have the node selected so it knows what's firing the ray and the null, excuse me.
Well, this is applied directly to the null,
Okay.
so it knows exactly where it's coming from. But there's other ways to affect it. It doesn't have to be the null's position that's affected. It could be something else where you But for this particular instance, it makes sense for it to be the null, so I'm going to leave it be. So let's recap what I just did. The quick version. Add a ground plane. Tilt it so it looks much more impressive when you actually do something with the RayCast geometry node. Add a null. Move the null over here. Move the null here. Keyframe it. And the reason I'm showing you this is just imagine trying to hand key that. This is, in this case, I'm just getting in the general area and letting the computer do the fine tuning. So target the ground plane, intersect, position. And that's a lot easier than you trying to hand key it to match that particular tilt. So let me show some more examples. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, you probably remember this from SIGGRAPH. Whoops, wrong one. Whoops. So take the rod, move it over here. And you see how its pivot point is positioned directly above my target geometry, which means that the default ray direction where it drops the ray straight down will work fine. Add Nodal Motion. Let me make that smaller so that you can see what's going on. Add RayCast Geometry. Target the camshaft so it knows what it's supposed to be aiming for. Plug intersect into position. Boom. Now it rests without you having to hand key that. Let me emphasize it. This is about saving you work. You put it in the general position that you wanted it to be. You put it over this particular part of the camshaft. But the RayCast node is doing the rest of the work for you, is to make sure that's always touching and positioned on top of that camshaft.
Is there a maximum distance you can put your object from?
Oh, a maximum distance? Like,
Yeah,
you mean if it's a...
You put it too far out and not close enough, in other words. Is there a point where it says, I'm not going to go touch that?
I don't see that danger. Like, where I see a danger happening is if...
Set the Y to like a kilometer.
Oh, sure. So let me do...
Yeah, just curious.
Still works.
Cool.
Let's go to the graph editor and make sure, like, nothing up my sleeve, that is, yep, that's 10 kilometers for the keyframe position, but it works just fine. It just means that when you turn this off, oh my God, where'd it go? So you probably don't want to position it that far out.
What happens if you're below the surface?
That is a better question, because if it's below the surface, the ray doesn't hit anything. There's nothing for it to do.
This is not pointing at it.
Oh, but there is a workaround. If, for whatever reason, the client demands that the keyframe be below the target geometry, turn off automatic origin. Or maybe it's actually automatic origin sure does seem convenient, doesn't it? Because you'd have to tell it, it's like you have to be all specific now. You have to tell it, I want it 1 meter above the target geometry, and that's great. But now I have to position it, let's see, -1. Oh, I went too far. Let me check the graph error to see what the original keyframe position was. It was, oh, it was that. So let me, there. So you can tell it, my ray, instead of automatically going from the object's pivot point where it's located by its keyframe data, you can give it a very specific position in space. And wherever that very specific position in space drops its ray, no matter where this thing is actually a keyframe, like if I can move it over, you can't see that I've changed much over there, but let's pull up the graph editor. But you can see in the lower left-hand corner that I'm clicking and dragging the mouse around because I'm dragging the item around. But because I hard-coded the ray's origin, it's staying right where I hard-coded it to be. So if I turn this off, move it over here, but then turn it back on, it's still going to be stuck there because that's where I told the ray to be. Well, let me take that off and put it back onto automatic origin. Let's see. There's actually another way to do an offset. There's another way to offset the ray without doing the hard-coded way. What it's doing when it has automatic origin on, it's effectively taking the item's position and plugging it in there for you. That's what it's doing. So, if you were to lie to it, by telling it, you know what, it's actually 1 kilometer above that. So if the client insists that the keyframe value be 1 meter below, you can lie and tell it, no, I want whatever its x and y, x and z values are, plus add a kilometer to the y.
If you move the camshaft, then do you have to do that again? Will it follow the camshaft? Let's hit it with a ray and it knows the relationship, or?
Here's what happens when you move the camshaft without moving boing, 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 boing.
So it's just reading whatever's directly below it? It's shooting rays out?
Yes, if you want them to move as a unit, let's parent them both to a null.
Okay.
Whoa. And move the null.
So if you clone the what you call the rod or the shaft up there, if you clone that, does it also clone the RayCast information?
It clones the motion modifier, and since the motion modifier is very generic, all it says is target this piece of geometry. It's nothing more specific than that. So when you clone it, actually I should show off quick clone. Well, now there's a 2-line Python script that ships with LightWave 11.6, and it's mapped to Alt-D by default. So Alt-D, move it over.
Awesome.
Although it looks like it's not far up on the Y, yeah. So again, Alt-D, move it over. Alt-D, move it over. Alt-D, move it over.
That a time saver. Wow. Wow. And that's in 11.6?
Yeah, quick clone. Alt-D.
And if you had multi-selected, like 3 of those, Alt-D would clone 3.
Let's do it. Alt-D. There you go.
Wow.
Awesome.
It's just running the fun without any
So, what it's doing, as Matt said, it's running clone for you without interrupting you with, well, how many clones? It's just clone. Alt-D. That's the default hotkey for it right now. So if you have your own keyboard shortcuts, you're going to have to put it back in. Just look for a quick _ clone. And it also might be good as for studying for Python scripting because it's just 2 lines of code. Import LWSDK, lwsdk.command, clone 1. That's it. Okay, so this is raycasting, simple raycasting for, now you may have noticed that there was a stuttering going on. Let me key this value in. Watch this one, it's going to stutter. It's going to kind of be placed and then kind of stutter. That's because sometimes it's at the right position for the ray to be to detect where it is. Remember, it has to always be above the target geometry, and sometimes it's above the target geometry, and sometimes it is not. Watch, this is where it's almost above the target geometry most of the time. And the behavior on that is going to be like this. So if you see it snapping like that, make sure that it's high enough above so that there's no risk of it ever intersecting with its target. Whoops. And also make sure that your key takes, because my preferred method of keys is AutoKey Existing, where you have to actually specify that you want a key. It'll modify existing keys, but it won't make any new keys unless you actually hit enter twice.
How long has that been there?
AutoKey Existing since,
It's like your 6.
well, it was a hidden mode until 11.
I never paid attention to that.
If you had AutoKey Create turned off, but you had, all right, in LightWave 10 and LightWave 6, if you had AutoKey Create turned off in the Preferences panel, but if you had AutoKey enabled in the interface, it would modify existing keys, but it would never create new keys, a new key in that spot unless you actually hit enter twice. Dave told me about that. I got addicted to it. When LightWave 11 exposed these modes formally, we petitioned that this be in there.
Awesome.
So if you have AutoKey, there's 2 places. Matt should be warned about this in case he has another mode that he prefers, but right now I've got Existing as the default for all new scenes. And for this specific scene, it's set to Existing. You can change it on the fly, but I'm used to Existing, so I'm leaving it there. Okay, so that's the camshaft example. Let's do another one. Any questions about this one, though, before I move on to another one? Again, can you imagine trying to hand key this?
No.
I mean, you could. I'm sure people have done it. Yeah, it's just you don't have to anymore. Okay, so that was using it to affect motions. Let's have it affect instances. So let me load some objects in. Let's load the human head. Actually, let's see. Then file load object. Help! 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 And let's load one more item in. Can everyone see what that is? All right. So, if I were to, okay, so let me show you how not to do this. Let's take the head, and I want. Has anyone ever seen those pin arrays where you put your hand underneath it and the pins take the shape of your hand? That's what this is all about. Now here's how you don't do that. I'm going to put the instancer on the head directly. I'm going to tell it add the nail, and I'm going to tell it to cover the surface with 1,000 instances. I'm going to tell it use local coordinates because I'd moved that nail up, so all of the instances were moved up. And let's display it as shaded solid. And that's cool and everything, except this is what happens when I rotate. If I move the head up and down, or if I rotate the head, the instances are tracking with it. If I move the head, it's okay, but it's not really what I wanted. I wanted those things to move over the head. I didn't want it to move with the head. I want it to take the shape of the head, but not in this way. I did not want a pin head. So let's remove that instance generator. And we'll zero that out. Now it just looks depressed. Let's parent this head to the rotate null. Oh yeah, here's another thing in 11.6. Thank you, Matt Gorner. Notice that the null has a different icon than the object. Oh, sorry, made a depressed head again. There, that's better. Now it's more affirming. Okay, so I'm going to add another null in there, and I'm just going to call it. Okay, so I'm going to add an instance generator to this one, and I'm going to say instance that nail, and tell it do a rectangular array. One set of instances on the Y. Let's see. And for the spacing, just trying to see like what's a good amount. Okay, and right now they're set to world coordinates. I can make it local coordinates so that they're all resting where the null is. And I can also tell them to appear as shaded solid so that I can get a good look at them. Let's get this out of the way so that we can kind of see what's going on. Okay, so again, I'm going to use nodes to position these instances so that they are affected by the position of the head. So I'm going to tell it use nodes, edit nodes. Now first, let's give them a Y offset. This is one of those things where I think it'll work if I do this. Actually, it might not. Because yeah, let me set that to uniform. Uniform would be this offset, but if you have it set to random so that there's two sets of values, minimum and maximum, that's what these guys are about. So let me set that to uniform. And let's see if this affects it again. Not what I expected. Oh, or was it? Oh, that's right. I know what happened. Whoops. Yeah, they went up on the Y. Well, was that too high? I think I accidentally spread them apart just a bit too. Let's see here. So I take that and plug that in, oh, okay, everything spreads out because, okay, what base position is giving me is it's giving me the truth. It's giving me the position of every single instance on here, which means that this guy over here might be a ½ meter on the X and another ½ meter on the Z, which means that if I'm plugging it into the offset, I'm doubling up his position. And I don't want to do that right now. It's like I do want to add to the evaluation. Let's see here. Whoops, wrong multiply. So let's take that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try this. Zero out the X and Z offsets and see what I get here. Again. Let's try adding like something there. That's easier to see. Yeah, it looks about right. Yeah, it looks about right. I guess 1 meter is a little bit too high for this, so let's try like 2. What I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to get it to go above the head. That's what I'm trying to do, trying to get it to go above the head. And just to make sure, let me just check my spacing. Like when I take all this off, okay, that's a good sign. It didn't get any wider, it didn't get any narrower. Okay, so what I did was I took the information like of the base position, I added a value of wide everything. I suppose if I didn't use base position at all, if I just plugged this directly into here, that would have done the same thing. Because this is a relative value. This is an offset on top of what it's already got. So if you're adding a value of 1, or in this case 0.2 on top of what it's already got, then everything just goes up. I realized that this all sounded very confusing just now, so does anyone have any questions about what the heck I just did?
So this is just a null, you're trying to move the null up?
Well, the null is still down on the ground. I'm trying to move the instances above the human head so that when I drop the rays, they'll hit the human head, that they won't start intersecting with the human head. That's my main concern here.
Would it have been the same if you just moved the null above the human head?
Yep, it would have been. So I probably, you know what? Let me not be clever here. Let me just take these instances and I accidentally rotate them. Zari, you're absolutely right. Let me keep it simple. Silly. There. Same thing accomplished in a different way.
I don't even know the
Same thing. I'm going to get a lecture when I get home about how I should have simplified this. Okay. Now I'm going to bring in the thing that we were talking about. So this one's a little different because if I only told it to just intersect and apply that to the offset, nothing really happens because it's looking the ray origin, it's not specific enough. In this case, we need the ray origin to spread across this array of pins. Let me close this. I should have had the ray origin spread. I need the ray origin to spread across this array of pins. And also, look at that. Did you see how they got wider? So that multiply thing, I'm going to have to bring that back. So I do want the ray to drop straight down, but the position has to be different. The ray has to be different for each individual pin, because not all the pins are right here at the pivot. Every single pin has a different starting position. So what you do is you tell the base position, you take the base position, you put that into ray origin, and that's a start. And then you tell the intersect to go into offset, and it almost works. Oh wait, there's another bit of business to it too. Would help if I told it what piece of geometry to look at. I'm going to tell it to look at the ground plane, I'm going to tell it to look at the human head. But you'll notice that there's a problem right now. You'll notice that it's inflated. It's an inflated look. And that's because what it's doing is it's taking the base position and it's giving me the intersect results, and I'm using that as an offset. I'm not using that as an override. I'm using that as an offset. I only want the Y positions here. So in order to get only the Y positions, I need to multiply X and Z by 0, because anything times 0 equals, everybody? Right. And anything times 1 equals what? Itself. So if I tell the Y position to multiply by 1, and if I tell the X and Z to multiply by 0,
Nice little, binary calculus.
well, okay, this might explain why I had to do that offset in the first place, to tell the rays to start above a certain position, because it's giving me sort of what I want. But let's put that offset that I had back in. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to drop the whole array down to 0. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that vector add, I'm going to add a value of 1 meter. So it's going to be the base position plus 1 meter, and that's what I'm going to feed into ray origin. And now it works, because it's firing the ray from above the current position of all of these, each individual instance. So now what I can do with this head is I can move it and animate it. And affects the position of the pins. Okay, that was a very long-winded explanation of what I just did. I took the base position of each instance, added a value of 1 meter to their Y positions, told RayCast Geometry use that as the starting point for each individual. Now the direction is all the same. Every single pin is firing straight down. But the ray origin for every single pin is tailored to fit the original starting point plus 1 on the Y of each individual pin. In RayCast Geometry, make sure that you tell it what geometry to target. Otherwise, without that ground plane, some pins might not have much to do. And to make sure that you don't accidentally inflate, because remember it's an offset, to filter out the values that you do want and get rid of the values you don't want. Multiply the values that you don't want, the offset values you don't want, by 0, and the values that you do want by 1. Wrong one. There. Any questions about this?
Jen, you remember when in the piston example,
Well, that's if you were cloning the nails, but you're not cloning the nails.
Oh, instancing is different?
Well, instancing, each instance doesn't have its own graph editor.
Okay.
At least I haven't done that. I know you can adjust the position of individual instances, sort of.
That's why you have to do it this way.
I'm affecting the placement of the instances. I'm using RayCast to place my instances, whereas before I was using RayCast to place my motion, to place my position. I guess it sounds like it's the same thing, the position of a single keyframed camshaft rod versus the position of a single instance. But I'm dealing with a different node editor here.
Okay.
I don't think you'd see much. I'll bet you what would happen is if I left the pin at world and I put RayCast on the motion of it, I'll bet you they would have all lifted up uniformly as a group as the nose went under it, like the one master pin.
Right.
That's probably what would have happened.
I see.
In this case, I want them as individuals.
Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions about?
Is there any limit to how many objects you can select for the rays to intersect, since you had ground plane and head in this one?
You're welcome to select, I suppose, as many objects as you have in the scene. However, I imagine that would incur a performance hit. It's better to just isolate only to the objects that you need.
I'm thinking of like a terrain or something, if you had like some little rocks, but you wanted, rock, ground plane.
Mm-hmm.
You could do all of those. Yeah, I have to think more. Yeah.
I was just thinking about that, in case you had a rover that had to go over terrain that had rocks.
Right, exactly.
So all you would do there, I was thinking, you would do a plot simulation, grade that on the terrain, and it'll take the shape of the terrain with all the rocks and everything. Then you have one object.
Just the
Let's
one
say
object.
transform, and then just,
Although you'd need to have a lot of vertexes then, right? A lot of polygons in that
when you're
plot.
initially doing it, then
Yeah.
you can take that object into modeler and polygon punch it,
Yeah.
reduce polys.
Okay. This one.
It's the nerdy mobile.
I'm gonna start with, again, Nodal Motion, and I'm gonna put in RayCast. I'm gonna tell it, look at this piece of geometry, and you think you're done, except something's not quite right. Let me put the centering on here.
Could that car be any smaller?
Here again.
You actually had something on it.
Oh, whoops.
It's going off in the distance.
Okay, happy?
Thank you.
Okay. Now, something's not quite right with this. Here's how 99% of LightWavers are going to handle this thing. Edit, import nodes, go to RayCast Assist in your example content, go to Nodal Motion, convert hit normal to heading, pitch, and bank. It's not my math. It's someone else's excellent math. Now, I'm going to take the hit normal from RayCast Geometry and plug it into here. I'm going to take the heading, pitch, and bank and plug it into here. And now it does what you expect it to do. This is why it's packaged as a compound instead of forcing people to deal with this on their own. This is the actual math. Double click on this to look at the math. It's not terrible, but it's easier to, I think when you're in a production, it's easier to just drop in a preset, hook it up, and get on your way. If you want to study the math, double click on it, look at it, and that's it. You can figure out like how to just put this exact network into your node connection. But and to exit out here, double click on that or on the input node, and you're out. So double click on output to exit, double click on it to enter, output to exit.
Jen, how did you get the load file requester to load that?
Oh, edit, import nodes. Have you ever saved node presets? It's the same thing as if you were to save out a .nodes preset.
Oh, okay.
It's just that in this case you're just loading in one node. Well, one node that contains a bunch of other nodes.
Gotcha.
So the intent of these prefabricated compound nodes in the 11.6 content directory is just so you don't have to deal with this. You just load this in, apply, like use it, plug this into here, plug that into there, and continue with your work.
Hey Jen, I got a question.
Yeah?
Say you wanted to now take the result of that, but you wanted it to catch a little air, like, to me it takes the fun out of animating it, looking at fly,
Ah,
up over the hill and all that stuff. So could you use that to get the broad strokes in and
here's how you do that. Let me replace with null. So now you have a null that's taking the hit. Let me just take the scale down. So now the null is doing the broad brush strokes. Now let me load the car in again.
just turn the car to?
Exactly.
Now it gets funny. All this automatic stuff.
What you're doing here is you're letting RayCast. Oops. I had parent in place turned on. And yeah. For Ken. Okay. So now you can do
Really off-road.
It's actually Hachigian drawings.
When she has the RayCast, their cartridge.
only when I'm late for users group meetings. Woohoo! So it's totally okay to use RayCast to just help you with the drudge work. In this case, the parts where it has to adhere to the ground.
Yeah.
And
Just, another question, Jed. If you back up, right there. Tires are intersecting. Is that because the null of the vehicle is not at the contact point of the tires?
let's see.
Do you have the mouse work on the spline?
Huh?
Do you have the mouse kind of work on the wheels?
Oh, I don't. I thought you had that. That's right. You have it at work, I think. In this case,
Yeah, you could basically put them on the edge and have them all kind of rolling around. Yeah, if you're doing it around the center of the collar, it's obviously not compensating.
oh, this might be part of it. This might be part of it. Wrong one. You see this part?
Yeah.
I think that's the culprit, so let's set continuity to that. So it should be a little better behaved. But again, also look at where it's positioned. In this case, this is the pivot. So for a very tight curve, it becomes obvious that the tires aren't perfectly locked, but that should help. I forgot I'm setting keys on everything, so let me. So it's less obvious when the car is smaller because the curve all of a sudden becomes broader in relation to the car. So you can't tell as much. If you did one of those rigs where each wheel has an independent sort of IK goal, so that you have a sense of suspension, each IK goal could have its own RayCast firing down so that they stick in place and that they behave themselves. In this case, it's just a simple, like, one size fits all. Like, there's a car parented to a null that's perfectly going along with the normal of the piece.
Yeah, if you look on the 11.6 review videos and various features on the website, you'll see one where it's like a normal rover and each of the wheels is independently using RayCast, so it can go absolutely any clock and all that stuff.
I just want to go through some other examples really quick. This is another motion. It's another motion example. In this case, it looks more complicated than it is. This is on the 11.6 content. This is why everyone needs to go log in and download this content. In this case, it looks complicated, but here's where the magic's happening is raycasting is being used to position the particle emitter. Instead of you hand keying the particle emitter being exactly where the ray is touching, intersecting with this surface, what's happening is that there's a null inside there called gun. You see where its z-axis is pointing? So if you were to go to here, this little emitter, and look at its nodal motion, in this case, gun, the null, it's analyzing where the gun is pointing as the ray direction, and its world position is the ray origin. So it's starting here, firing a ray straight where the gun is pointing, and wherever it hits this terrain geometry, that's where the null's going to be. If it wasn't for this, the null would just be stuck here all the time. Look at that, that's just where the null is. With it, it does this really complicated looking animation, and then you just turn on particle effects to drag out the slag. Does that make sense? That's the null. The null at the end of the laser is the one that's being affected by RayCast Geometry. The ray is being fired by a null that's parented to the droid.
By a node that's being parented to the droid.
Yep.
Okay, so the laser isn't the
This
laser itself is a geometry that the null at the end, or what's it?
the laser.
Or is it bones, or
Let's see. It looks like it's a light.
it's a laser? It's a laser.
Yeah. If you hide the laser light, you don't see anything.
The kind of way to think about RayCast is it's just a start point and a direction.
Okay.
So those two things you need
Yeah.
to see where to intersect as well. But in terms of planning where to shoot, so that's basically what's on here.
So you have a particle system attached to the.
Yeah.
So whatever the node touches, the particles are ignited.
Yeah. So you get follow some like laser beam curve and stuff,
Very cool.
and it all matches the
Very,
geometry.
very cool.
Now, RayCast Geometry is appropriate for anything that doesn't have to do with rendering. So you'll use it for deformations, instancing placements, and motions. And I haven't shown you deformation yet. So let's see if I remember this. So I'm going to deform the tube. So I'm going to select the tube, set its subdior to last so it looks nice. Go to Edit Nodes, and put in RayCast Geometry. Tell it to target the egg. And here's another preset that I'm going to load. Import nodes. Again, it's one of those things where it exists so you don't have to think about the math. RayCast nodal displacement. Heat shrink. So plug normal into there, plug distance into there, and plug the result into there. Let's see if I'm missing anything. I might be. One moment. Oh. Yeah, maybe if I did the ray origin, my apologies. This is very, 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 very important because right now the ray origin, it's all being fired from the same spot. Remember how I warned you, Zari, about like if you were to apply it to one of the pins, it's...
Yeah, right.
Well, that's what's happening here. It's not being unique for every individual spot on this tube. But when I plug this into here, it will be. And let's see, that's not... Is that what I wanted? Whoops, okay. So let's just check one thing. There, that's better. Okay, that's a pretty extreme offset. So let's see. Let's see if a scalar of 0 is an improvement or not. One moment. Just curious why it's such a dramatic look here. Oh, that, yes, I'm so sorry. Let's plug that into ray direction, eh? Because right now they're all firing downwards. That's better. Now let's plug this into here and inflate it. Whoa, that's too much. There we go. Okay, learn from my mistakes. What I did wrong was I didn't tell it, I just left these at the default. I told it, oh yeah, fire down, and if you hit something, do something. Well, no, I want it to fire from the normal. I want it to fire from the normal, and I want the rays to be fired from all over the tube, not just on the center, from the center of the tube. So that's why you have to hook these guys up. Does that make sense?
So you find rays from the tube to track the edge.
Yep.
Like, this would work well for where a cartoon character punches another guy in the stomach, and then the impression of his fist shows through the guy's back that he hit.
That's one application. One very violent application. And again, just to give you a glimpse at the math that it's saving you from, it's not, again, it's not that big of a deal, but it's 3 less nodes that you have to hook up here. So that's what heat shrink does, the heat shrink node does for you, is it figures all this stuff out so that you don't have to. Any questions about this one? Because I'd like to show you guys spline instancing, but before 4 o'clock rolls around. Any more questions about raycasting? Does it look hard? Oh crap. It's not hard. That's the important thing to know, is that it's not hard. It's like parenting. There's a lot you can do with it, or targeting. There's a lot. It's kind of like think of it like targeting. There's a lot you can do with it. You just have to spell out where you want the ray to start, where you want the ray to go, and you can use it for effects like this. Okay, I'm going to show you some cool stuff. Like this wasn't cool enough. Okay, I did touch on spline instancing earlier this year. So hey, look at this. I'm going to do Alt-D, 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 Alt-D. And I'm going to add a null to parent them all to, call it spline.
You could show those scripts together, actually, like
Oh yeah, I'll be showing or you mean show what the script looks like?
no. If you go to setup.
Oh, the curve to, I'm going to,
Nope, not that. Go to setup. And it'll be hidden right at the bottom. Under that, because the screen's too small now.
What-
It can even, it's not even more thing. What's going on there, actually? Well, underneath that assignment, a bunch of things there. There's a whole bunch of things where basically storing the item ID of anything, and then you have to say all these other things about selected target or model or hold. So you don't have to
Change the resolution again if you
list of
want.
the promotion options, but it's you can't see it. It's really sweet.
You want to go back to 1920 and let's screw you. I have no idea. As long as it doesn't throw up an error button.
okay, I'm going to hit M for motions.
The San Diego like we used to do. I can't remember what the name of it now. You were doing that. You were like showing off the script.
Yeah, spoke script.
Yeah, he's. I can't remember this.
Oh, it'll be fun.
Anyway, a whole bunch of people started saying, you should just add these to the
Problem solved. Okay, so I've got a spline, and the way I made the spline was I have a hierarchy of nulls, and I have another item in the scene that is referencing, big important thing, if nothing in the scene is referencing this hierarchy as a spline, the spline does not exist. Something has to see it in order for it to exist. So I'm going to take the spline, go to properties, instance. Take that, local, just for kicks, and let's see, let me move this over here. I'm going to tell it what type. I'm going to tell it go to spline. Okay, how many instances? 100? Okay, that's fine, except they're all stacked on top of each other. How about 0.1 separation? You can also tell it to distribute, to evenly distribute along the spline so that as you increase your, then instead of specifying like a physical separation between these, this is specifying a 1 centimeter separation between them. This will be 2 centimeters. This one just auto distributes along the length of the spline. Oh, and offset will move them up and down the spline. So a value of 1 would be 1 meter along, push it 1 meter along the spline. So if you wanted to animate this, okay. I just shift clicked it to get rid of that because I want to emphasize that it's stretching to fit the length of the spline because I've got distribute turned on. If you were to bank these controls, it'll respect that. Has anyone here played with spline instancing yet? Cool. And it also respects the state of the spline. So if the spline in question, if you go to controllers, let's see. I'm looking at the wrong item. I need to go to the spline itself. If an item is referenced as another item as its spline control item, this will appear. If I turn this on, it becomes a closed loop. Which is good for tank treads or watch bands. Of course, there's always this one. let me set them all right side up again in terms of bank, because I've got, oh yes, that's an important thing. When you have a spline, like the heading really matters on the spline, because if they're not all sort of pointing at each other, and I can correct this really quick, if I go to the nodes of the spline and I tell it they're heading spline control, they'll notice how all of a sudden all their headings are, because I don't specify any specific spline control, they're all referencing the spline that they belong to. I'm going to hand key their heading values right there and then take that off. You see that? That just fixed it. The reason it fixed it is because, look, now each heading is pointing along the length of the spline. So the heading values are pointing where the spline should be going. Everyone catch that? Because if a heading is pointing in the wrong direction, look at that error. Because you're twisting the spline. It's sort of looking to this heading as guidance for how the spline is supposed to twist. And once the heading's all nice and neat, then you can start using the bank to do like sort of a twist that you intend, an intentional twist. Any questions about that? Because I want to show you curve to spline. Has anyone played with that yet? This was a request by a user, Dave. I'm trying to remember now if it was Dave Tracy. But there was a user who had a big challenge because he was trying to deal with very large spline controls and layout with hundreds and hundreds of nodes. And he wanted an easier way to do that. So I wrote a script where you can load a spline that you make in Modeler. Have people here made splines in Modeler? Has anyone here not made a spline in Modeler? I'm going to show you how to make, for those in the audience who have not yet done it, I'm going to show you how to make a spline in Modeler. So you go to create points. This is one way to do it. Just I'm right clicking to make some points. Hit Control P. That's one way to do it. That's a spline right there. I'm hitting K to kill that curve. And now I'm just going to drop my current tool and just select one and select it in the order that I want the spline to be drawn, and hit Control P.
And if you had selected the opposite way, what would happen?
Then the head of the spline will be in a different position. Although if you hit F to flip it, you can do the same thing. See the head, as I hit the F key to flip this polygon, the head appears in a different spot. So then you save this object out and you've got a spline. So I'll save object as. So I'm going to take test spline into layout. And layout does not have direct support for splines, but if you go to wireframe, you can kind of see where the points might be on here. It might be better if you go to vertices, because at least there's no question as to where the points of this thing are. So let's go to Setup and go to Edit, Curve to Spline, and you run this script, and a spline appears, or rather a virtual spline. What I should do is I should run that again. Let me clear that out and clear this out, because this was also generated by the spline. So I've only got this object in the scene. When I run curve to spline, in this case, anything that is checked in the scene editor can become, that is parented in effect to the spline, can become a node of the spline. That includes bones. And the advantage of using bones over nulls in this case is that it doesn't add to your object list. You can collapse it, don't have to even think about it, you can just use the spline. This object was added by the script. Its purpose is just so that the spline shows up, because if nothing in the scene references it as a spline, the spline, the virtual spline does not exist, which means you can't use it for spline instancing. If something is referencing it as a spline control, and it is, then the script won't add it. So I'm going to replace this with another one that I did. And let's, if you go into Modeler and load that same object, that's what this spline looks like. So I'm going to run this again. Whoops. Sorry, setup, more curve to spline, and it'll update the existing 6 nodes and just append, oh, existing spline control nodes found. Would you like to update the existing nodes on the selected object? Sure. Now I've got quite a big spline, so I'm going to select all bones of current object and hide selected items. Still an awfully big spline. So I might want to go to my preferences just for the purposes of this and tell it, you know, when I've got it selected, leave it as a curve. You can choose whether to show it at all, curve only when selected, a ribbon when selected, a curve at all times, a ribbon at all times, or a curve when it's not selected and a ribbon when it is selected. Right now I'm going to tell it curve, just because there's an awful lot of data here. We load in chain link, which is this little guy. And I'm going to tell this spline, or this hierarchy, I'm going to add an instance generator, add the chain link object. I'll set it to local law of habit, but it doesn't really matter. Go to spline mode. I'm setting it to evenly distribute along the spline. I'm going to give it an offset to animate it pushing along the spline. And I'm going to make them a bit bigger than they are now. Whoops, wrong one. Now, left to its own devices, you'll notice that it's starting to leave the curve because it's not a closed curve. But you can fix that by going to the motion options for this spline and making it a closed curve, so that they just loop around that spline forever. Oh, there is another cool thing you can do. Let's give it a uniform offset, and you don't have to go into nodes for this. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but you don't have to. Check that out. So I'm just going to have it move up on the Y. And the turbulence texture is giving an offset to the instances as a whole. So you have something that looks complicated, but that took me about 10 minutes to set up, 5. Any questions about what's going on here?
Your bicycle tire has a problem.
So you can do other fun stuff with it too, just so it's not too perfect. So that there's just a little bit of shift between them. Actually, that would be kind of cool, wouldn't it? I haven't done that yet, but let's. It's the Christmas ornament from hell, run! Ah!
I sense a sci-fi channel movie on this. We can just get a shark in there somewhere.
Spline NATO.
Every little chain could be a shark.
Yeah.
Each one wiggling a little different. Should be like cool new DNA chain for next media stuff.
Any questions about this fun little tool? Oh, there is also, if you have a virtual spline that you want to export as a curve back to modeler, what you do is you select the root of a hierarchy, and it doesn't have to be a spline control hierarchy, it just has to be a hierarchy, and go export spline. Tell it where to save out the spline, and you'll be able to load that in a modeler. Oh, in this case, it was using the world coordinates. So that's why it's not centered the way the original was. So yes, it doesn't have to be again, it doesn't have to be a spline hierarchy. Any hierarchy, what it'll do is it'll go and find all of the children of that hierarchy that have no children of their own. Because that's the one rule that spline control follows, is that it has to be the childless fringe of the hierarchy. And it'll export a spline based on that. So you can use that to get it, so you can use those two tools, curve to spline and export spline. Curve to spline will get splines from modeler into layout, and export spline will get a virtual spline from layout, out of layout and into modeler for you.
Cool.
So that's spline instancing in LightWave 11.6. Okay.
Oh, the only other thing, well, I was going to try and get Jen to show, but she, the screen was too small when she was doing it. So I'll give a quick demo of what I just did before we started again. Some of you might have seen this already, but let me just go and items, array. This is not it, I'm just setting something up here. And I just need a few lights, that's all. So I've got all those lights. If I add a null, and I can just put it somewhere. Let me go bigger here so you can see it. Okay, so if I wanted to make all those lights point at that null, so before you'd have to kind of go in here and go target, and then if you had a lot of things in this list, as Jen kind of showed, you're scrolling around for a lot. So you can just select the light now, or the null, or anything that you want to target actually, and go to setup, say store selected, and that's in the background store the ID of that item. So then if I go to lights and select all those lights, and normally this is not crunched up like this, so I can say assign target, or I can assign the parent or the goal or the spline control or the position rotation scale. Or you can bring up a UI for it and do a whole bunch of them in one go, if it makes sense. And you can also clear any specific thing, or again you can clear by a UI, or just say clear everything. So it's just if you've got a huge load of lists in that or items in that pop-up menu, you can get to it much quicker now. So that's just another aside.